December 1944, the Ardennes forest. While Hitler's desperate gamble rages through Belgium's frozen hell, one American corporal faces an impossible choice: follow orders and abandon a wounded enemy to certain death, or risk everything for a principle that war seems designed to destroy. What happens next in those 100 yards of open snow will challenge everything both men believed about their enemies and themselves. This is the story of the moment when humanity refused to retreat. Part 1, The Weight of Snow, December 22, 1944, 0800 hours, 4 kilometers southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. The snow fell like ash from a burned-out sky. Corporal Thomas Miller pressed his back against the frozen trunk of a shattered oak, its bark stripped away by machine gun fire 3 days prior. His breath came in crystalline clouds that hung in the air before dissipating into the gray morning. 23 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 147 pounds after 2 weeks of near starvation and constant movement through the Ardennes hell. His hands, wrapped in strips torn from a dead German's tunic, gripped an M1 Garand rifle with the kind of casual tension that comes only from holding something so long it becomes an extension of your body. 15 feet away, propped against what remained of a stone wall, sat the German, Heinrich Vogel. The name had come reluctantly, whispered through cracked lips 2 hours after capture. 19 years old. Lanzer, infantry, from some unit whose designation Miller couldn't pronounce and didn't care about. The boy, and he was a boy, Miller could see that now in the pale morning light, had taken shrapnel to his left leg during the American counterattack that had finally stopped the German advance through this particular slice of frozen Belgian farmland. The wound had been bleeding steadily for 6 hours. Miller had used the last of his sulfa powder on it, though he couldn't say why. Orders were orders, and orders said, "Keep prisoners alive for interrogation." But Miller knew, in the place where truth lives beneath official reasons, that he'd done it because the crying had been getting to him. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Morrison's voice, tinny and urgent. "All units fall back to checkpoint Baker. Incoming artillery. Repeat, fall back immediately." Miller looked at the German. Heinrich looked back. Between them lay an understanding that needed no translation. The boy couldn't walk. His leg had swollen to twice its normal size, the flesh tight and discolored beneath the rough bandaging Miller had applied. To carry him would be to move at quarter speed across 400 yards of open ground, while German mortars, those screaming demons the men called moaning minis, rained down steel and fire. "Miller!" Sergeant Kowalski appeared at the edge of the tree line, his face a mask of controlled panic. "You deaf? Get your ass moving." "The prisoner, Sarge." "Leave him. That's an order." And there it was. The moment crystallized like the ice forming on Miller's eyelashes. Leave him meant leave him to die. The German artillery, when it came, and it would come, it always came, didn't distinguish between the mobile and the immobile, the armed and the helpless. The boy would die here, alone, in a foreign forest, because moving him was inconvenient to the timetable of retreat. Miller had been raised in a white clapboard church in Marion, Indiana, where his father had preached about the Good Samaritan every other Sunday. He'd enlisted in June of 1942, 3 days after graduating high school, because everyone was enlisting, and because the war seemed like the kind of grand adventure that happened to other people in other times. 29 months later, he'd killed 11 men that he was certain of, and perhaps 20 more that he couldn't confirm. He'd seen his best friend, Eddie Carmichael from Kokomo, take a sniper round through the throat and drown in his own blood while Miller held him. He'd learned that he could eat, sleep, and function while watching other human beings torn apart by machines designed for exactly that purpose. But he'd never learned to not hear the crying. "Sarge," Miller said quietly, "I can't do that." Kowalski's face contorted. Behind him, the first mortar round whistled overhead, that distinctive rising shriek that meant you had 5 seconds to decide whether to live or die. The explosion came from the east, 200 yards away, then another, closer. "Miller, you stupid son of a bitch!" Go, Sarge. I'm right behind you." Kowalski stared at him for 3 heartbeats. Then he was gone, crashing through the undergrowth toward the American lines. Miller moved to the German. Heinrich's eyes, which had been closed, opened. They were blue, startlingly so, like the summer sky over Lake Michigan that Miller had seen in another lifetime. "You leave," the boy said in fractured English. "Yeah, well, I'm not great at following orders." Miller bent down, working his arms under the German's armpits. "This is going to hurt." It did hurt. Heinrich's scream cut through the morning as Miller lifted him, and something hot and wet soaked through Miller's uniform where the wounded leg pressed against his side. Fresh bleeding. The boy was coming apart. The mortars were finding their range now. The distinctive crump crack of German 88s walking across the field, each explosion sending up geysers of frozen earth and snow. Miller had maybe 3 minutes before the barrage shifted to cover the tree line where the American position had been. After that, the ground would become a churning hell of steel, fragments, and concussive force that would turn his organs to jelly inside his chest. He started walking. The physics of carrying another human being across broken ground under fire are simple in principle, complex in execution. Heinrich weighed perhaps 130 pounds, light for his height but heavy enough when every step required lifting both feet clear of snow that came up past Miller's ankles. The boy had wrapped his arms around Miller's neck in a desperate grip, his breath hot and rapid against Miller's ear. Each step jarred the wounded leg, and each jar brought fresh sounds of pain that Miller tried not to hear and couldn't avoid. 50 yards from the tree line, Miller's right boot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. A root, a rock, a piece of shrapnel, it didn't matter. He went down hard, Heinrich still clinging to him, both of them sprawling into the snow that was no longer white, but churned brown and red from the shelling. Miller's rifle, which he'd slung across his back, dug into his spine. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight of the German pressed him down, and for a wild moment he thought, "This is how it ends. Suffocated under a dying enemy in a Belgian field whose name I'll never know." Then the mortars found them. The physics of high explosive artillery are less simple. A German 80mm mortar round contains roughly 3 pounds of TNT. Upon impact, this explosive converts to gas at approximately 26,000 feet per second, creating an overpressure wave that propagates outward at supersonic speed. Within 10 feet of the explosion, the overpressure exceeds 60 pounds per square inch, enough to rupture lungs, tear organs from their moorings, turn a human body into a collection of broken vessels leaking into itself. The round hit 30 feet away. Miller felt the ground punch upward, felt the air turn solid and slam into him like a physical thing. His ears stopped working, not went deaf, but simply stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch that disconnected sound from existence. He was aware distantly of Heinrich's weight no longer on top of him, of his own body tumbling through space, of the strange silence that accompanied what should have been the loudest moment of his life. He landed on his back. The sky above was gray and seemed very far away. Snow was falling again, or maybe still falling, or maybe it had never stopped and he'd simply lost track of time's passage. His legs didn't seem to be working properly. When he tried to move them, they responded sluggishly, as if the neural pathways between brain and muscle had been lengthened somehow, messages arriving late and garbled. "Get up." The thought arrived in his father's voice, which was strange because his father was 3,000 miles away in Indiana, probably preparing Sunday's sermon in his small study with the leaded glass windows that threw colored light across his desk. Get up. Miller got up. Heinrich was 10 feet away, face down in the snow. Miller crawled to him because crawling was currently more reliable than walking. The boy wasn't moving. Miller rolled him over, and Heinrich's eyes opened, still blue, still impossibly blue against the pale gray face. "Can you hear me?" Miller's own voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Heinrich's lips moved. No sound came out. Or if it did, Miller's broken ears couldn't detect it. But the boy's hand came up, gripping Miller's sleeve with surprising strength, and that was answer enough. Miller got his arms under Heinrich again. His legs were working better now, the shock wearing off, or maybe just being overridden by whatever autonomous system takes control when conscious thought isn't enough. He stood. Heinrich was heavier than before, or Miller was weaker, or perhaps both. It didn't matter. The American lines were 70 yards away, then 60, then 50. More mortars. Closer now. The Germans had observers somewhere, in the church steeple 2 kilometers south maybe, or hidden in the ruins of the stone farmhouse on the ridge, and they were adjusting fire, walking it across the field in a systematic pattern designed to ensure that nothing living crossed that open ground. Miller walked anyway. At 30 yards, Sergeant Kowalski appeared at the tree line, screaming something Miller couldn't hear. At 20 yards, 2 more soldiers emerged, running toward him in a crouch. At 10 yards, Miller's legs finally gave out, and he and Heinrich went down together one last time. Hands grabbed him, lifted him. The world tilted and blurred, and then Miller was being dragged backward over snow and frozen ground. Heinrich beside him, both of them pulled by soldiers whose faces Miller couldn't quite focus on. The mortars were still falling, but they were behind now, chewing up the ground that Miller had just crossed, rewriting the map of that Belgian field into something cratered and smoking. And then they were in the trees, and someone was pushing a canteen into Miller's hands, and Lieutenant Morrison was standing over him with an expression that combined fury, wonder, and something that might have been respect. "Corporal," Morrison said, his voice filtering through the high-pitched whine that was all Miller's ears could process. "What the hell were you thinking?" Miller looked at Heinrich, who was being tended to by the company medic. The boy was crying, silent tears tracking down his dirty face, and his hand was still reaching toward Miller as if afraid that the connection, once broken, might not be restored. What had he been thinking? Miller tried to find words for it. This thing that had made him lift another human being and carry him through fire when every instinct screamed to let go, to run, to save himself. Was it his father's sermons about loving enemies? Was it some dim memory of who he'd been before the war taught him that human life was cheap and mercy was a luxury? Or was it something simpler and more terrifying? The knowledge that if he'd left the boy to die, he would have crossed a line from which there was no return, would have become something that could sleep through crying without waking. "Sir," Miller said finally, his voice steadier than he felt, "if we let this war take away what makes us different from them, then what the hell are we fighting for?" Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharply, and walked away. Part 2. The distance between enemies. The field hospital at Bastogne was not technically in Bastogne. The actual town was surrounded, had been since December 20th, when German forces had completed their encirclement of the American 101st Airborne and attached units. The hospital was 3 kilometers northwest in a commandeered Belgian farmhouse whose original occupants had fled a week earlier, leaving behind empty rooms that now held men in various stages of dying. Heinrich Vogel would not die. The medics had stabilized him within an hour of his arrival, though the consensus was that he'd lose the leg. Not today. Not here, where resources were stretched thinner than the bandages wrapped around the wounded, but eventually in some rear area hospital where surgeons had the luxury of time and proper equipment. For now, he lay on a stretcher in what had been the farmhouse's parlor, surrounded by 24 other wounded, German and American, separated by nothing more than the arbitrary accident of which side of the room they'd been placed on. Miller sat against the wall 15 feet away, drinking ersatz coffee that tasted like burned acorns and watching the German boy sleep. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Private First Class Jerome Washington lowered himself to the floor beside Miller, with the careful movements of a man whose body hurt everywhere at once. Washington was from Philadelphia, had been a jazz pianist before the war, and possessed the kind of sardonic wit that served as psychological armor against the things they saw daily. What was about?" Miller asked. "Don't play dumb, Indiana. You carried a Kraut through a goddamn mortar barrage. There are guys taking bets on whether you're shell-shocked or just plain stupid. What's the spread? 60-40 in favor of stupid. Washington sipped his own coffee, grimaced. Jesus, what did they make this out of? Better not to ask. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Outside, the sound of artillery was constant, a low rumble that provided the bass line to the higher notes of small arms fire and the occasional scream. The Germans were still trying to break through to Bastogne proper, though with less conviction than they'd shown 3 days ago. Word was that Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north from Luxembourg, that relief would come by Christmas. Nobody quite believed it, but the rumor was enough to keep going. You know what I think? Washington said finally. I think you looked at that kid and saw yourself. White boy from small-town America, probably drafted same as you, probably scared shitless same as you, and you couldn't square leaving him with whatever story you tell yourself about who you are. Miller considered this. That supposed to be profound? I'm a jazz musician. We specialize in profound. Also in being broke, but that's a different conversation. He was crying, Miller heard himself say. I kept hearing him crying, and I just couldn't leave him there. Washington nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. He was quiet for a moment, then, you know the thing nobody talks about? How easy it is. Killing, I mean. You think it's going to be this huge thing, this moral crisis, right? But when some bastard's shooting at you, it's just mechanics. Point, squeeze, watch him drop. It's the other stuff that eats at you. The kid begging for his mother while he bleeds out. The dog that won't leave its dead owner. The stupid, pointless suffering that doesn't advance any objective or serve any purpose. So what do you do about it? Hell if I know, Miller. But I figure if carrying one kid across one field makes you feel like you're still human, that's worth something. Washington stood, his knees cracking audibly. Even if it does make you 60% likely to be stupid. He wandered off, leaving Miller alone with his coffee and his thoughts. Heinrich woke at 1400 hours. His eyes found Miller immediately, and for several seconds they simply looked at each other across the room full of wounded men. Then the German boy raised one hand, a small gesture, barely a wave, but weighted with meaning Miller couldn't quite parse. Miller stood and crossed to Heinrich's stretcher. Up close, the boy looked even younger, his face still holding traces of adolescent roundness beneath the grime and stubble. Someone had cleaned the worst of the blood off him, had rebandaged the leg with proper medical supplies. The limb was immobile beneath heavy splinting. You stay, Heinrich said in careful English. You not go. I'm not going anywhere for a while. We're kind of pinned down. 9, infield. You stay. You. He struggled for words, his face twisting with frustration. Warum? Why? Why? The question Morrison had asked, the question Miller had been asking himself for 6 hours. Because somebody had to, Miller said finally. Heinrich's brow furrowed. He chewed his lip, thinking then, in training, they tell us Americans are, wie sagt man, Feiglinge, cowards, weak. They say you have too much. You are soft. You cannot fight like German soldier. Yeah, well, we've been hearing similar things about you guys. But you come back for enemy. This is not weakness? Miller thought about it, about the propaganda lectures they'd all endured, about the carefully curated hatred that was supposed to make killing easier, about the stories of German atrocities, some true, some exaggerated, all designed to create a bright line between us and them, between the righteous and the damned. Maybe it's the opposite, he said. Maybe it takes more strength to help than to hurt. Heinrich was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible above the background noise of the hospital. I think they lie to us. About many things. Yeah, they do that. My brother, he is in Normandy. Last letter June. He say the Americans, they are like... Heinrich struggled again, made a gesture with his hands like something pouring out. Wie Wasser, like water. Never ending. Always more. Tanks, planes, food, everything. He say, this is why Germany cannot win. Because you have too much, and we have too little. And in war, this is what matters. Miller felt something shift inside him at these words. He'd known, of course, about American industrial capacity. Everyone knew. But to hear it from the other side, to understand that German soldiers were looking at American supply lines and seeing their own doom written in tons of steel and fuel, that was different. That made the whole thing real in a way it hadn't been before. Your brother, Miller said carefully, is he? I do not know. No letters since June. Heinrich looked away. Probably dead. Most of us, probably dead. The matter-of-factness of it was somehow worse than grief would have been. This was what the war had done, made 19-year-old boys speak of their own probable deaths with the same tone they might use to discuss the weather. Listen, Miller said. When this is over, when they move you back to a POW camp, you're going to be okay. We're not. You do not kill prisoners. Yes, I know this now. Heinrich's blue eyes found Miller's again. In field, when you lift me, I think, now he will shoot me. Is easier. But you do not shoot. You carry. This is, he shook his head, apparently out of English words. Human, Miller supplied. Ja, menschlich. Human. They fell silent again. Across the room, someone was screaming, one of the American wounded, caught in some nightmare that morphed pain into dream and dream into waking horror. A nurse moved to him, administered morphine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this action hundreds of times. Corporal Miller, Heinrich said suddenly, when war is finished, if I am alive, I will remember this. What you do. Don't worry about it. 9 is important. You show me that enemy can be human. This is thing I must remember. Miller wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture the strange weight of this moment. Two boys from opposite sides of the world, thrown together by historical forces beyond their control, finding in extremity a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries of nation and ideology. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded. Yeah, he said, I'll remember it too. Part 3. After the snow, December 26, 1944, 1100 hours. The relief column from 3rd Army arrived at dawn, their tanks churning through snow that had finally stopped falling. Patton's forces had smashed through the German southern flank, breaking the siege of Bastogne and sending the Wehrmacht into a fighting retreat that would continue through January. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would later be called, was entering its final phase. Miller watched the tanks roll in from his position on the perimeter, where he'd been since Heinrich's evacuation to a rear area hospital 3 days prior. The boy had been taken out on one of the last C-47 supply flights, strapped to a stretcher alongside 8 other wounded, both American and German. They'd exchanged a final look as the plane's doors closed. Nothing dramatic, just a brief acknowledgement of something shared that neither could quite name. Lieutenant Morrison found Miller after the morning briefing. The company had been rotated off the line, would spend the next 72 hours in reserve before being sent north to participate in the final push to eliminate the German salient. Morrison looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week, his face drawn and gray, but his eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before the mortar barrage. "Corporal," he said, "got a minute?" They walked to what remained of the stone wall where Heinrich had been captured. The field beyond was cratered and scorched. The snow melted away in great patches where artillery had superheated the ground. It looked like the surface of another planet, hostile and alien, and Miller found it hard to believe he'd crossed it carrying another human being. "I wanted to apologize," Morrison said. Miller looked at him in surprise. "Sir?" For the order to leave the prisoner, it was the right tactical decision. We needed to move fast, couldn't afford to be slowed down. But it was the wrong human decision, if that makes sense. You showed me that. I wasn't trying to show anyone anything, Lieutenant. I was just being human. I know. Morrison pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, offered one to Miller, lit both with a battered Zippo. You know what I realized, watching you? That we've been at this so long, we've forgotten there's supposed to be a difference between us and them. Not just German and American. I mean between people who remember they're human and people who've let the war burn it out of them. Miller drew on the cigarette, let the smoke rasp down his throat. It tasted harsh and perfect. I got a letter from the chaplain at the POW camp, Morrison continued. The German kid, Heinrich, right? He's going to keep the leg. They operated, cleaned it up, looks like it'll heal. Chaplain said the boy asked him to pass along a message. Tell Corporal Miller I remember. You know what that's about? Yeah, Miller said quietly. I know. Morrison nodded. He smoked in silence for a moment, then, I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star. Meritorious service under fire, initiative above and beyond. You'll probably get it too. Patton's handing them out to anyone who showed guts during the siege. That's not why I did it, sir. I know. That's exactly why you deserve it. They finished their cigarettes, watching the supply trucks roll in, laden with ammunition and rations and all the material, plenty that the German soldier had recognized as their doom. Miller thought about Heinrich's words. Like water, never ending. Thought about how strange it was that American abundance, the very thing that made them soft in German eyes, was also the thing that would win the war. Not courage, not ideology, but simply the capacity to produce more bullets than the other side could fire, more tanks than they could destroy, more men than they could kill. And he thought about the 100 yards between the tree line and safety, and how that distance had contained everything important about the war and nothing important about the war simultaneously, because wars were fought over resources and territory and grand strategic objectives, but they were survived by individual acts of humanity that had nothing to do with any of that. You ever think about after? Morrison asked. After the war, I mean. Every day, sir. What do you figure you'll do? Miller considered. Before the war, he'd had vague plans involving college, maybe law school, the kind of American dream trajectory his father had worked his whole life to make possible. Those plans seemed impossibly distant now, artifacts from a different person's life. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know I don't want to forget. Forget what? That moment, when I had to choose between orders and humanity. I want to remember that I chose right because... Miller struggled to articulate it. Because I think that's the only thing I've done in this whole goddamn war that I'm actually proud of. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. Hold on to that, Corporal. We're going to need men who remember how to choose right. He walked away, leaving Miller alone with his thoughts and the scarred field, and the memory of blue eyes in a gray face asking, Warum? Epilogue, What They Carried Forward. April 1945. Buchenwald concentration camp, Germany. Thomas Miller stood at the gates of Buchenwald and understood that he'd been wrong about everything. The camp had been liberated 3 days earlier by elements of the Third Army. Miller's company had been among the first Allied troops to enter, and what they'd found there had rewritten the map of human possibility. Not expanded it, reduced it, shown that the basement of human behavior went deeper than anyone had imagined. The bodies, the ovens, the survivors who were more skeleton than human, who moved with the slow deliberation of the already dead. The carefully documented records of medical experiments, of systematic degradation, of industrial-scale murder implemented with German efficiency. Miller had vomited twice in the first hour. Then his body had simply stopped responding to the horror, had shut down some essential circuit of revulsion, because maintaining it would have meant going insane. And now he stood at the gates and thought about Heinrich, about the boy crying in the cold, about the choice to carry him, to risk everything for the principle that humanity transcended uniform and nation, about how proud he'd been of that choice, how it had felt like proof that he was different, better, capable of moral clarity even in war's chaos. But if Germans could build places like this, if the same culture that produced Beethoven and Goethe could produce Buchenwald, then what did his small act of mercy mean? Was carrying one boy across one field supposed to balance against tens of thousands systematically murdered? Was individual humanity supposed to redeem collective evil? He didn't know, couldn't know. The scales were too unbalanced, the math too terrible. Corporal Miller. He turned to find Colonel Patterson, the regimental commander, standing behind him. Patterson looked like he'd been crying, though his eyes were dry now, scoured empty. "Sir, I understand you carried a German prisoner to safety during Bastogne." Word traveled, even through the chaos of the final offensive, even with Germany collapsing around them, word traveled. "Yes, sir?" "I'll bet you're feeling pretty stupid about that right now." Miller opened his mouth to agree, to acknowledge the obvious truth that mercy had been wasted on people capable of this. But the words wouldn't come. Because standing here in the shadow of Buchenwald, he realized something that shattered his certainty even further. Heinrich hadn't built this place. The boy in the snow had been 19 years old. A draftee like Miller himself had probably never known places like this existed until long after he'd been forced into uniform and sent to die in Belgium. The men who built Buchenwald were real, were German, were human. But they were not every German, were not Heinrich. And if Miller had left the boy to die because somewhere in Germany other Germans were building death camps, then he would have crossed his own line, would have become something that categorized humans by group rather than individual choice, would have become, in his own small way, part of the same machinery of dehumanization that had made places like Buchenwald possible. "No, sir," Miller said finally. "I don't feel stupid. I feel like I did the only thing I could do, and stay human." Patterson studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, Corporal, because if individual conscience doesn't matter anymore, if we're all just representatives of our tribes, then—" He gestured toward the camp. "Then this wins. Not militarily. We've won that. But morally. This becomes the truth about human nature, and everything else is just pretending." He walked away, leaving Miller alone again with his thoughts. June 12, 1947. Marion, Indiana. Thomas Miller stood behind the counter of his father's hardware store, ringing up a customer's purchase. 5 pounds of nails, a new hammer, some sandpaper. The man was building a deck, he explained, wanted to get it done before his daughter's wedding in August. Miller made small talk, wished him well, watched him leave. Outside, Marion was drowsing in early summer heat. The war had been over for 2 years, but the evidence of it was everywhere. In the new houses being built for returning veterans, in the car dealership that had reopened on Main Street, in the small memorial in the town square bearing names of boys who wouldn't be building decks or watching daughters marry. Miller had come home in December of 1945, had been demobilized with the rank of sergeant and a Bronze Star, with V device that sat in a drawer in his childhood bedroom. He'd enrolled at Indiana University on the GI Bill, had made it through 1 semester of pre-law before realizing he couldn't concentrate enough to do the reading. The words would swim on the page, would transform into other words, other images. He'd withdrawn, had come back to Marion, had started working at his father's store because it required no concentration beyond what the customer in front of him needed. He was okay with that, mostly. The bell above the door chimed. Miller looked up from his inventory sheet and froze. The man who entered was perhaps 22 years old, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been rebuilt incorrectly. He wore civilian clothes, cheap but clean, and walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg swinging stiffly from the hip. Blue eyes, impossibly blue. "Guten Tag," the man said, then caught himself. "I am sorry. Hello? Good day? I am looking for Corporal Thomas Miller?" Miller's voice wouldn't work. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Heinrich?" The German's face split into a smile that transformed him from stranger to the boy in the snow. The connection instantaneous and complete. "You remember," Heinrich said, and the relief in his voice suggested he'd feared otherwise. They stood staring at each other across the store for several heartbeats. Then Miller was moving, coming around the counter, and Heinrich was moving toward him, and they met in the middle in an embrace that carried 2.5 years of distance and dissolution. "How are you here?" Miller asked when they finally separated. "How did you find me?" "Is long story. I am in prisoner camp until December last year. When they release me, I go home to Germany, to Cologne, but Cologne is—" Heinrich made a gesture of demolition. "Is all broken. My family, my mother and sister, they are alive, but have nothing. So I think I must go to America. I must find the man who showed me that enemy can be human." "Jesus, Heinrich, No." The German's face was serious now, earnest. "You must hear this. In camp, I have much time for thinking. About war, about Germany, about what we do. And I think, if Thomas Miller can save enemy life, then maybe there is hope. Maybe humans can choose to be human, even when war tells them not to." He pulled something from his pocket, a small notebook, battered and stained. "I write this. In camp. All my thoughts about what you teach me. About how strength is not just killing, but also saving. About how true victory is to stay human when everything says be animal." He held it out to Miller. "I want you to have this. So you know, what you do in snow, it changes me. Forever." Miller took the notebook with hands that trembled slightly. He opened it to a random page, saw German script in careful, cramped writing. A word caught his eye. Menschlichkeit, humanity. "I can't read German," he said. "Is okay. I learn English now. I translate for you if you want. I translate everything, every word, because this is important. This is the thing we must not forget." Miller looked at the young man in front of him. Not German, not enemy, not even prisoner, but simply Heinrich, a person who'd been carried through fire and had carried the memory forward into a life that shouldn't have existed. "Yeah," Miller said, "we must not forget. Not